Hello wrestling fans. Welcome back to the $20 million Pro Wrestle Machine studio and welcome back to the show. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. February 9, 1998, Wrestling Observer Newsletter. A look at ratings and attendance, UFC political issues. By Observer staff. It's already well established that 1997 was a big year for American wrestling. Just how big? Both WWF and WCW reached high marks for the past 6 years when it came to attendance. WWF increased attendance by 19.4% over 1996 and television ratings by 1.1%. However, the WWF started the year doing poorly overall on television ratings, and largely through forces having little to do with the WWF. Better quality lead-ins on Saturday and Sunday, and some that did, an increase in Monday night ratings in November and December, showed substantial increases in the fall over last year. Overall, both attendance and ratings are trending upward as the year came to a close, leading to the current boom period for the company. World Championship Wrestling had a phenomenal year, showing a 59.1% increase in attendance, even more impressive since it was coming off a year that had a 56% increase from the year before. The increase came during a year that WCW greatly increased ticket prices across the board. WWF actually showed a greater percentage increase in attendance in 1996 than WCW, with a 61% increase. Although WWF continued going up in 1997, it was not at the same level. Ironically, in 1996, the year the WWF showed such a huge attendance increase, the perception of the industry in many cases due to people paying so much attention to Monday night ratings, was that the WWF was losing to WCW for the first time ever. The ironic part is that using the Monday night ratings, which WCW has won in every head-to-head matchup since the summer of 1996, ignores that WCW has traditionally always for the one-year period been ahead of WWF when it came to cable ratings. It was just that before 1995, nobody really paid this kind of attention to ratings. For the entire year, while WCW came the closest it ever has during a one-year period to the World Wrestling Federation in attendance, it still trailed by a few hundred fans per show. Despite the success of Nitro, which for the year increased 15.6%, overall WCW ratings declined 1.8% because weekend numbers had never reached the low levels they achieved this year. With the addition of Thunder in primetime combined with the elimination of the company's two poorest rated shows, Pro and Main Event, television ratings will show a huge increase in 1998. Any study of figures show that it is the wrestling business, and not the companies themselves individually and independently of each other, that have their ups and downs, although the companies do to differing degrees. The wrestling business hit the skids in the wake of all kinds of problems, such as the steroid scandal, not the public realizing wrestlers were taking steroids, but the advent of legitimate testing in the WWF, which caused so many of the wrestlers known for their physiques to quit the promotion for all kinds of strange reasons, leaving in their wake a group of former mid-card smaller wrestlers to carry the promotion, combined with some of the worst booking during the spring and summer of 1992. It hit rock bottom in 1993, and there was the beginnings of the turnaround in October 1995 for both companies, which also coincides with the beginnings of Nitro and the Monday Night Wars. I don't think anyone can argue the point that the Monday Night Wars are responsible for the turnaround in the pro wrestling business, although it is not the only factor. Currently, WCW is increasing in popularity at a faster rate than WWF, and has surpassed WWF in buy rates, although the companies had been dueling rather closely for about 2 years, has maintained its ratings lead although not widened the gap, although the gap will widen in 1998, and has closed the gap in attendance to where going into 1998, it would not be a surprise to see WCW overtake WWF in that category as well. In the past, even as late as 1996, a $100,000 gate for a house show was considered very good unless it was one of the 3 big arenas in the New York City market where $150,000 would be considered successful. WWF for the year 1997 averaged $94,562 per show, and this isn't including pay-per-view shows, so the actual live event average could have approached or possibly even topped $100,000. Due to increasing ticket prices, it would for the year be a 26.9% increase in per-event house show revenue over 1996. WCW, which didn't get into the increasing house show ticket prices as quickly, but gradually as the year went on actually increased to higher prices for most of its live events than WWF, in many markets averaging more than $20 per ticket, finished the year averaging $87,413 per event, more than doubling, actually a 113.9% increase, the 1996 figure of $40,875 per show. What should be noted is that when WCW started increasing its ticket prices, over the final 7 months of the year, the June through December period, it averaged $101,736 per show, and WWF averaged for the same last 7 months of the year $99,192. So it has basically been a dead heat over the past 7 months, and the $100,000 figure has turned into what under today's standards for both companies is actually just an average house show. There really aren't a lot of conclusions that we can draw from the television ratings. Fact is that overall TV ratings were no higher this year than last, even though the perception is, and a true perception it is based on buy rates and live attendance, that wrestling is hotter than ever. As we've noted many times, basically every year or every time we study this, there is no correlation between television ratings and attendance at live shows, even though that statement on the surface makes no sense, and even though right now as we're writing this, Monday night television ratings, arena attendance and buy rates are hitting simultaneous high-water marks. In the case of WWF, ratings for the year were the second lowest, slightly ahead of 1996, over the past 6 years, yet from a business standpoint it was by leaps and bounds the best year during that same 6-year period. WCW, through the success of Nitro, did show only a slight decline overall in ratings, but even with a highly rated primetime show, the WCW ratings are still no better than they were when the company just had non-primetime TBS weekend programming, and attendance was in the sewer. It's a staggering thought that in 1993, without a live primetime wrestling show and only with the weekend TBS shows, that the overall ratings average for WCW programming was equal to 1997 with all the 4.0 ratings that Nitro delivered and basically the same weekend programming. Yet during that period WCW only averaged 960 fans per show, while this year it averaged more than 5 times as many. One conclusion when it comes to attendance and gates, and this is a conclusion proven out numerous times over the years, and that is the higher the ticket price to the event, the more tickets will be sold. That goes against economic logic, but it is at least of late proven to be the case. In 1992, when Kip Frey took over for Jim Hurt at the helm of a beleaguered WCW, his first move in office was listen to complaints from fans on radio shows telling him why attendance was so bad and that the ticket prices were too high for live events. So he slashed prices, and the response was, fewer fans were attending the shows. Slowly prices moved back up and slowly attendance went back up. In 1997, with Zane Bresloff in charge of promoting WCW house shows, WCW increased prices once again to another level, actually higher scale than WWF tickets, which actually caused WWF to believe WCW was going to price tickets out of the market range and hurt future business in those markets. As it has shown, the increase in ticket prices has only resulted in more sellouts, actually for both companies. As stated here many times over the years, wrestling ticket purchases are what is known in economics as emotional rather than logical buys. If people want to see the event, they pay whatever the going price is. They may complain about the price being too high, but they do pay it if they want to see it. Same with pay-per-view. When WWF increased the in-your-house price from $14.95 to $19.95 and now to $29.95, with every price increase, buys as a general pattern also increased. If people don't want to see the event, for the most part, you can't give it away. Actually, that's too strong a statement, and people that have attempted to do business selling things on the internet about wrestling would contradict that statement. And I do recall in the 80s when promotions experimented with all seats $5 nights. They usually drew very well the first time with a low price, but the second time at the low price they were back to their average attendance, just with a far lower gross. There has been a theory espoused to me that the current environment, where wrestling is hot with high school and college-age kids, that a high-priced ticket becomes even easier to sell. Guys won't take girlfriends out to an event as a date if it's for an $8 seat because it's seen as a cheap date, but they'll be glad to take them for a $30 seat, even if it's the exact same seat. It's always been the most expensive tickets that sell the fastest, of course mainly because they are the better seats, but a gimmick of late is to expand the number of higher-priced seats as people are more willing to spend $30 than $8 for the exact same seat. Somehow there is a psychology that the more expensive a ticket is, the more valuable it is and the more people want to buy it, and that when people go to the ticket window and find out the expensive seats are gone, they often decide not to buy any ticket at all, thus making it make sense for a promotion to scale as many tickets as possible in the expensive category. We'll try and look at All Japan and New Japan next week. In a story which sounds more serious than it probably truly is, TCI Cable at press time had not agreed to carry WrestleMania 14. There are various versions of this complicated issue. Apparently TCI is trying to use its own power of pressure, Since it is the largest cable conglomerate in the United States, making up approximately 15% of the addressable homes, to try and protect the sport of boxing, or at least the conglomerate's ability to make as much money off the sport of boxing. The TCI position is that it won't agree to carry WrestleMania until Tyson's exact role in the show is defined for them ahead of time and until it gets assurance from the Nevada State Athletic Commission that role wouldn't in any way affect his reinstatement to boxing. Ultimately, there is no question that whatever Tyson does or doesn't do at WrestleMania isn't going to affect his reinstatement hearing, or he wouldn't be doing it in the first place. And in the long run, there is too much money at stake for TCI and WWF not to come to an agreement to carry the show. Tyson's participation in Mania was really toned down on the live Raw television show on February 2nd in Indianapolis in favor of getting over the task at hand, the February 15th pay-per-view from Houston, as the prime focus of the show. Tyson, Shawn Michaels and DX and Steve Austin were all scheduled for a press conference on February 5th at the All-Star Cafe in Manhattan, in which presumably the main event at Mania and Tyson's role on the show would be explained. We're not certain if this announcement will or won't be the true announcement, as the information we understand is the press conference is just another step in the ultimate angle, which won't be completed for a few more weeks. It did appear from the television that the references from the previous week by Don King to paint the Nevada State Athletic Commission as the bad guys in stopping Tyson versus Austin were dropped, and instead the story is that Michaels and DX want the match worse than anything so Michaels doesn't have to defend the title against Austin, thus attempting to make Austin versus Michaels as the match the fans really want to see, because the beneficiary of Tyson versus Austin is the hated heel Michaels. And speaking of Michaels, he wouldn't be in line to do a job on pay-per-view without an injury cropping up, now would he? After taking a dangerous backdrop over the top rope with his lower back cracking on the casket at the Royal Rumble on January 18th in San Jose in basically the very first spot of the match, Michaels missed shows the weekend of the Super Bowl, complaining that as the week went on, his back had stiffened up. This past week, Michaels' doctors sent word to the WWF that he had a variety of ailments, including a bruised kidney, a slightly separated shoulder, both hips out of alignment, a sprained foot, vertebrae in his back out of alignment, not to mention a worsening of his chronic knee problems. Michaels, along with Vader for reasons mentioned last week, were pulled from all house show bookings for at least the next month, with the exception of the February 15th pay-per-view, since it's an 8-man tag in which his participation can be limited, causing all of the cards to have to be reworked. We have no word as to when Michaels will return as far as working house show matches, but the belief from this end is it would be smart to keep him out of the ring except where necessary until WrestleMania, so he can't come up with another late injury to keep him off the show, and thus finding a way to not have to drop the title. With Undertaker also out of action, and Austin working a more limited schedule, it means in some of the smaller cities that all three of the WWF's top draws won't be appearing on the shows. However, business for both WWF and WCW is so incredible at this point that it doesn't seem to matter, with WWF selling out 4 of its 5 weekend dates, a few well in advance, the first 2 of which didn't include any of the big 3, although we don't know the matches advertised that actually sold the majority of those tickets, which at some point probably included some if not all of the 3, although advertising in all the new cities is being changed reflective of the new cards without Michaels. Michaels' injury cancels the 2 scheduled Canadian dates for title defenses against Owen Hart. Coming off the Survivor Series match, the Michaels vs. Owen Hart advance for February 21st in Toronto had already hit $187,000. 7,700 tickets, and the February 27th Vancouver advance had already broken the city's all-time gate record with 10,045 tickets sold for $219,523 as of the weekend. The city record was $214,985 set for the July 21, 1996 pay-per-view show, headlined by Owen Hart and Bulldog Invader vs. Michaels and Ahmed Johnson, and Psycho Sid as a late replacement for the fired Ultimate Warrior. Both shows will now be headlined by Austin vs. Hunter Hearst Helmsley in a singles match, plus New Age Outlaws defending the tag titles against Cactus Jack and Chainsaw Charlie, Rocky Maivia defending the IC title against Ken Shamrock, and Hart defending the European title against Goldust. Those are also the top matches March 1st in St. Paul. In the other mainline cities for February, including February 6th in St. Louis, February 12th in Miami, February 14th in Tampa, and February 22nd at the Continental Arena in East Rutherford, New Jersey, the main events will be 6-man tags with Austin and Jack, who is dropping both the Mankind and Dude Love personas at least for the time being, and Charlie vs. Outlaws and Helmsley, except in St. Louis since Helmsley doesn't return from his own knee injury until February 12th, so in St. Louis it'll be Maivia. On the smaller shows where Austin isn't working, it'll be Maivia vs. Shamrock as the main event and Charlie and Jack vs. Outlaws, so they are after all having Terry Funk work a full schedule. While Funk can get away with doing far more comedy than in ECW, and Jack can carry the bulk of the physical load for him in Austin last year in ECW and building up to his title win, they had him work a lot of weekends, which from a travel schedule is far less taxing than the WWF full-time schedule, to the point it took its toll physically to where he wasn't getting over at all on a lot of shows, including even in Philadelphia. The Continental Arena undercard will also have Hart and Shamrock vs. Farouk and Maivia, LOD vs. Godwins and Goldust, and Mero vs. Chains and Johnson. And in yet another twist involving Tyson as the pay-per-view comes up, it was reported as a rumor in the February 3 New York Daily News by boxing columnist Michael Katz that rumors sweeping boxing over the past day stated Tyson was about to split with Don King. The story claimed rumors have spread through boxing that Tyson wanted to get rid of King along with his co-managers, Rory Holloway and John Horn. Rumors spread through King's business archenemy Bob Arum. The story claimed that the pro wrestling had something to do with it, but wasn't clear whether it was Tyson being inspired by having a wrestling career, or displeased with the publicity he was getting for associating with the WWF, and again claimed Tyson's role would be as a referee. The rumors continued that Tyson was mad that King told him that he had to get a cut of whatever the WWF offered Tyson. Tyson was said to be leaning toward going with a conglomerate to manage him that would include Magic Johnson, who has just taken out a boxing promoter's license, Jerry Buss, the owner of the Forum and longtime Los Angeles Lakers owner, and Rock promoters Jerry Walkt and Irving Asoff. Apparently within boxing the belief is that Tyson wants to go with Johnson, but that Tyson is tied up contractually long-term with King. How this would affect WrestleMania is unknown, although it would enable the WWF to have a stronger storyline reason for not having the Tyson vs. Austin match after the Nevada Commission didn't provide them with their most convenient out. It also appears there is far less to the Pax net deal than meets the eye. An angry Bud Paxson, who is starting the family-oriented 7th broadcast network in August, came back from Natvi furious at the WWF for what he said was a misleading media release about WWF becoming a regular on his network. According to Paxson, the WWF purchased 8 weeks of infomercial time leading to WrestleMania in February and March on Paxson's 73 television stations, most of which are largely infomercial stations, until the fall. Paxson indicated it was a short-term deal and that when his network debuts in August that WWF won't be a part of it, at least not during daytime or primetime hours. For the weekend shows, WWF drew a sellout of 6,120, paying $130,961 on January 30th in Huntington, West Virginia, a sellout for an afternoon show on January 31st in Columbus, Ohio, drawing 6,408, paying $96,535. The only non-sellout for a January 31st evening show in Cincinnati, Ohio, which I believe was to include a benefit for Brian Pillman, drawing 7,709, paying $133,364. A sellout on February 1st in Louisville, Kentucky of 5,772, paying $105,260, and the Raw taping on February 2nd in Indianapolis drew a sellout 12,043, paying $193,279. Merchandise figures were way up as well, with a total of $354,068 or $9.30 per head. A return of the biggest drawing Valley Tudo match of the modern era between Rickson Gracie and Nobuhiko Takada was announced by Kakutogi Revolution Spirits, KRS, for October 11th at the Tokyo Dome, exactly 1 year after their first bout in the same location. The match was announced at a Tokyo press conference on February 2nd with both in attendance. Gracie, who is also in Japan to promote a new clothing line bearing his name, said that this would be his only fight in 1998. Takada, who quit the Kingdom promotion just a few days earlier, said that he would still be open to do other matches as tune-ups before October. Gracie's announcement kills whatever chance there was, and realistically there was no chance to begin with, of Gracie being the final opponent for the retirement match of either Antonio Inoki in April, where there was no chance, or for Akira Maeda in September, where there was also no real chance, although Maeda had been promoting the idea of it for the past several months. Gracie, reputed in some circles as being the best fighter in the world, although he has never taken on any upper echelon NHB fighter since the NHB movement became popular in the United States and Japan over the past 4+ years, easily defeated Takada, a pro wrestling legend with a manufactured shooter reputation who had actually never been in a legitimate NHB match before in his career, in 447 before a crowd estimated at 40,000. Last week Takada, along with other Kingdom Pro wrestlers including recent UFC tournament champion Kazushi Sakuraba, Yui Sano, Minoru Toyonaga and Shunsuke Matsui, left Kingdom. Apparently a Nagoya billionaire set Takada up with a Tokyo gym where he'd teach both martial arts and bodybuilding, scheduled to open in April, and Takada took several of the Kingdom wrestlers with him to help train and open the gym. At a press conference, Takada said that his wrestlers would still do Kingdom and would be open to other martial arts fighting events such as UFC, but would not do traditional pro wrestling such as New Japan. There had been talk that Takada would join up with Antonio Inoki's World Martial Arts Federation as an NWO-type heel group within New Japan and work lucrative dome dates. With Takada and Sakuraba leaving, Kingdom was rumored to folding after its January 28 show in Tokyo. However, at that show, Kingdom boss Ken Suzuki, a longtime personal manager of Takada and who at one time was the president of Takada's fan club, announced Kingdom would be continuing with a major show in Tokyo in March, plus overseas cards in May in Hawaii and June in Israel. KRS announced one more match for its March 15 Pride 2 show at Yokohama Arena, which reportedly has a poor advance for Mark Kerr vs. Bronco Sikatic and Gary Goodridge vs. Marco Ruiz as headliners, with Kerr's appearance still in question due to his New York State court fight ongoing with Semaphore Entertainment Group regarding his UFC contract. That match will pit pro wrestler Sakuraba, coming off his UFC tournament victory, against Royler Gracie, a smaller brother of Royce Hickson, who has won numerous world championships in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, competing at 147 pounds and is unbeaten in NHB. That match will be intriguing largely because Gracie, having the edge in experience, will be giving up about 35 pounds to Sakuraba, who has a few matches under his belt, although did have a somewhat fluky win of a UFC tournament on December 21 through winning only one match. KRS also announced it would be running Pride 3 at a major arena in Japan in June. The only match announced for that show will be Kimo vs. pro wrestler Sano, and that the October Tokyo Dome card will be called Pride 4. UFC has reportedly been interested in using Takada to headline its planned May return to Japan. With Takada already having the Gracie match on his table, it would necessitate Takada either being put in a work situation or being put in with an opponent so easy the outcome would be guaranteed, as at this point he can't afford a loss. Ken Shamrock and the World Wrestling Federation have a big money contract to the Japanese promoters of UFC, and there were assumptions it would be honored in May as well, although it appears any thoughts of matching Takada with Shamrock are out the window, as Takada simply can't afford that risk. WCW business this past week doesn't have to take a backseat to WWF by any means. The company drew near record business for its two shows this past weekend, on January 31st in Boston at the Fleet Center and Nitro on February 2nd at the Alamodome in San Antonio. The Boston show, which was scheduled as the first ever internet pay-per-listen event, drew the largest crowd and gate in company history for a non-televised event, drawing a sellout 18,759 fans, 18,134 paying $325,154. For a card headlined by a Hulk Hogan vs. Sting cage match in the same building that WWF is running in 2 months for the already sold-out WrestleMania. 2 nights later at the Alamodome, WCW drew the second largest crowd and third largest gate in company history. Crowd trailed only the January 5th Georgia Dome show, and gate also trailed the December 28th Starrcade show, with 21,213 fans, 20,005 paying $446,135, but destroyed all previous company records for merchandise totaling $249,842, or a near record rate of $12.49 per paying customer. San Antonio, for whatever reason, has long had a reputation for doing for concerts about the best merchandising business of any major city in the United States, and it proved no different for WCW. Boston merchandise totaled $138,914. The previous WCW merchandise record was $172,000 set at the Georgia Dome show, and the all-time U.S. record remains $540,000 for the 1987 WrestleMania at the Pontiac Silverdome with Hogan and Andre. The Boston show would have set an all-time gate record for pro wrestling in that city, although that figure will be easily broken by WrestleMania. We don't have exact figures for Mania at press time, but it will probably be at or near the $1 million mark. It would also be the largest indoor crowd ever for pro wrestling in Boston and should top Mania because of seats killed for pay-per-view production, although there had been several outdoor crowds in Fenway Park during the Dano O'Mahony and Gus Sonnenberg eras that topped 20,000 in the early 30s. Due to the success of the Boston house show, WCW is now planning on running similarly loaded house shows besides February 20th in Las Vegas, but also March 25th in Baltimore and March 28th in Auburn Hills, Michigan, with similar lineups headlined by Hogan Sting cage matches. The San Antonio figure would have been the second largest pro wrestling crowd ever in that city and the second largest gate for pro wrestling ever in the state of Texas, trailing only last year's Royal Rumble, which drew 60,525 fans, 48,014 paying $480,013. However, the WWF spent far more to draw actually a similar-sized gate and used many discounted coupons to do so one would suspect the actual profit margin on the Nitro Live show, with just $45,000 budgeted for advertising, would have far exceeded that of the Rumble. Nitro itself was a lackluster event, carried mainly by the continuing Randy Savage vs. NWO soap opera largely this week involving teasing a Hogan vs. Savage split. At press time, no television ratings for the weekend were available, reportedly due to a computer problem at Nielsen. Reports from Boston were that it was a crowd that came to see the stars rather than see the wrestling. Even though the show started about 25 minutes late, the Boston Bruins had a 3 p.m. game in the same building and it was late getting the arena ready. They kept the show going until 11:45 p.m. The show was to be the debut of an internet pay-per-listen concept for $7.95. But that had technical problems to where the audio wasn't available until the main event, so everyone's money was going to be refunded. Notes from the Boston show were: 1. Bill Goldberg destroyed Buddy Lee Parker in 120 with a jackhammer. Goldberg got the expected huge pop coming out of the blocks. 1 star. 2. Booker T retained the TV title, pinning Michael Wallstreet in 6:06. Wallstreet was subbing for Rick Martel, who suffered a concussion on January 26 when T gave him the Harlem Hangover, but instead of landing with a leg drop, accidentally landed with his butt, flattening Martel's face. 1/2 star. 3. Chris Jericho retained the Cruiserweight title, beating Dean Malenko with the Boston Crab in 15:28 2¼ stars. 4. Steve McMichael pinned Greg Valentine in 8:59 with a tombstone piledriver. McMichael did a lot of radio pub for the show the day before, claiming WCW was the major leagues and comparing the WWF to the Red Sox minor league farm team in Pawtucket and WCW to the Boston Red Sox. He also hyped his match as being with Curt Hennig, although that's probably because nobody clued him in. As it was, Valentine got a huge pop, 7th biggest of the show, from fans who remember his name for his matches against Pedro Morales, Tito Santana and Bob Backlund when he was a headliner. Dud. 5. Steiners beat Raven and Perry Saturn in 8:15 when Scott pinned Saturn with a Frankensteiner off the top rope after Rick had Raven set up for one of their double-team finishers. Rick again walked out on Scott. Ted DiBiase wasn't there. Scott used a power bomb during the match. Said to be the best match on the card. 3 stars. 6. Chris Benoit beat Eddie Guerrero in 15:32 using the crossface submission. Match was a huge disappointment as Guerrero spent most of it stalling. 1½ star. 7. Bret Hart beat Ric Flair in 13:32 with the sharpshooter submission. Similar style but not on the level of the pay-per-view match. The two got incredible pops coming out, with Flair getting a huge standing ovation and Hart's reaction actually being louder. The two got by far the biggest reactions of anyone on the show. 2 stars. 8. Lex Luger and Diamond Dallas Page and Larry Zbyszko, subbing for the Giant, beat Kevin Nash and Scott Hall and Randy Savage in 10:31. The crowd was totally behind the Nash team. Page got a 50-50 reaction, Luger got 70% boos and Zbyszko was booed out of the building. The survey was definitely pro-NWO, and Hall and Nash got the next biggest face reactions on the show. Hall and Nash came out together without Savage and the match started 3-on-2. About 5 minutes into the match, Savage showed up to a big pop. It ended up with Savage in the ring, and Hall and Nash just walked out on him. Savage then ran away from Luger and tried to leave as well, but Zbyszko cut him off and threw him back in for Luger to rack. 1¼ stars. 9. Sting beat Hulk Hogan in a non-title cage match in 12:33. It was under pin or submission rules, as both actually climbed out of the cage and at one point brawled outside. Both men bladed, which I guess they can get away with doing. Both men were cheered, although Hogan received more cheers than Sting, although for reaction they ranked 5th and 6th respectively. Finish saw Savage get into the cage and interfere, but came off the ropes and hit Hogan instead of Sting, allowing Sting to use the reverse DDT for the pin. Apparently the finish reads much better than it was executed because it was said to have been totally screwed up live. Nash and Hall then hit the ring and attacked Sting. Luger came out for the save. Luger racked Savage while Hogan and Sting fought to the back while the ring became target practice for fans. Hall and Nash stayed in for several minutes collecting garbage, thanking fans for sharing their beverages with them. ECW's fourth pay-per-view on March 1st in Asbury Park, New Jersey looks to be shaping up following Angle's show at the January 31st card at the ECW Arena in Philadelphia. The key angle was during the announced main event, a 2-on-3 match with Bam Bam Bigelow and Taz versus Shane Douglas and Chris Candido and Lance Storm before a packed house of 1,600 at the ECW Arena. After maybe 3 minutes of wrestling, Bigelow turned on Taz by laying him out with his ECW TV title belt. About 1 minute later, Candido turned on his tag team championship partner Storm, hitting him with a tag title belt. As had been promised on television earlier in the week, all three members of the Triple Threat raised their fingers together, but instead of Storm being the third member, it was back to Bigelow, with his turn a few months back to set up the November 30th pay-per-view main event was blamed on the departed Rick Rude. The other angle, perhaps the most tasteless angle in wrestling at least since the death of Brian Pillman, involved setting up a feud between Tommy Dreamer and Justin Credible. Before the scheduled final match on the show with Dreamer and Sandman versus the Dudley Boys, Sandman asked for a 10-bell salute telling the audience that Dreamer's grandfather had passed away, which is true. As everyone stood in attention, Credible came out and interrupted at around the 7th bell. He grabbed the house mic and said that he was sorry, trying to start out respectful, then paused and said he was sorry that it was Dreamer's worthless, useless grandfather who died instead of Dreamer, naturally causing Dreamer to attack him. Using deaths to sell wrestling tickets is nothing new, but no less tasteless today than when Fritz von Erich did it, although even von Erich never went so far as to have the heels gloat over the deaths of his sons or a family relative to get heat, or when the Freebirds made similar remarks to Mike Graham after his father committed suicide to start their feud in Florida, or when Vince McMahon and Hulk Hogan used an ongoing war to build heat on Sergeant Slaughter for a WrestleMania match. Of course, this is more of an anything-goes era with limits having been stretched, but even so, the belief that McMahon used Pillman's death and a tease throughout the show of an interview the next night with his wife to build ratings on Raw was voted the most disgusting promotional tactic of the year and decried heavily throughout the industry. Actually, Heyman himself bordered on this level last year when he had New Jack do an interview talking about a close relative who had died in the projects and getting emotional about the death to set up the Eliminators attacking him. It really didn't cause much attention to begin with. In that case, the entire scenario about the dead relative was a work, which actually in some cases may have made the scenario even more tasteless. Coming out of the show, it appears the March 1st show will feature Storm and a mystery partner against Douglas and Candido, Taz versus Bigelow for the TV title and Dreamer versus Credible. The only match actually announced thus far is Masato Tanaka versus Wing Yukihiro Kanemura from FMW. While not announced yet, there was a television tease this week teasing the possibility of Sabu versus Rob Van Dam. Paul Heyman was unsure of the status of Sandman due to him being basically crippled right now with a myriad of injuries. The insanity continues. Just hours before a nearly sold-out amateur shoot fighting event was scheduled to take place in Phoenix, Arizona on January 30th, the owner of the Celebrity Theater canceled the show apparently due to political pressure put on by Senator John McCain. When learning of the event, McCain, probably the most influential opponent of the politically crippled ultimate fighting genre, sent a letter to Maricopa County Attorney General Rick Romley attempting to get the event shut down. McCain, who didn't even apparently understand what the event was, as he had it confused with an ultimate fighting event, wrote in his letter that unlike boxing or traditional martial arts, unrestricted or ultimate fighting competitions are not legitimate sporting contests. They pose a great risk of serious injury to the contestants, and present excessive brutality to the public as entertainment. The amateur event being shut down at the last minute came just one day after the Arizona State Boxing Commission refused to sanction or allow a professional show under the same rules to take place in Phoenix on February 15th, largely blaming the promoters for not following proper procedure, and also claiming the rules of the event were inconsistent with the commission rules on events under their jurisdiction. The rules they were apparently referring to were professional boxing rules. Because the January 30th event was an amateur event, it didn't have to go through the Boxing Commission. The shoot fighting rules that this event, and a subsequent event planned and also shut down on February 15th, were running under were rules closer to Pancrase or the Amarillo-based USWF than to UFC. No punching to the face would be allowed, although body punches were legal. There were no strikes of any kind to the throat, spine or kidneys allowed, along with headbutts, elbows, one-finger strikes and knees all being banned. Pancrase allows knees. Cranking headlocks, which are legal in USWF and Pancrase, were also banned from this event, although this event did allow heel hooks, which are banned in Pancrase. Even though head punches were illegal, contestants were mandated to wear UFC-style grappling gloves. These rules didn't stop the local newspaper, the Arizona Republic, when commenting on this controversy, to talk about the event, as the bloody bouts of bareheaded or bare-knuckled fighters punching, kicking and choking each other even when down on the mat. So we now have the latest chapter in the hysteria, both from the media and fueled by headline-grabbing politicians looking for an easy subject to appear to oppose violence, while in many cases largely protecting the business interests of professional boxing, a more dangerous sport, in front of a public that largely doesn't understand the actual issues involved. This was largely responsible for putting the extreme fighting promotion out of business and crippling UFC to the point that many of the larger cable MSOs refuse to carry the events. Anything even remotely associated with UFC are often painted with the same brush, such as Viewers' Choice Canada refusing to carry a relatively tame submission wrestling pay-per-view event based on the brutality issue and the fact many of the fighters were known in the NHB world. In this case, shoot fighting, a more sport-looking event in that there are more rules and it is fought within a boxing ring as opposed to the safer but more controversial octagon cage, is opposed largely because it is fighting but not under traditional Western boxing or acceptable kickboxing rules. The fact it is more the name and association with NHB rather than the rules of the sport or dangers that are its problem can be documented no place better than California. In 1997, during an ESPN taping for its summer series of kickboxing shows in San Jose, there was one match scheduled under shoot fighting rules involving local product and former UFC competitor Brian Johnston. Ding, ding, ding. The bells and sirens go off. UFC. The original rules of the match were to be similar to pancrase, with open-handed blows to the face legal and kicks legal along with wrestling and submissions. But once the commission got involved, the rules were amended again at the last minute, first banning the open-handed blows, and later banning any kicks, so the event actually turned into a submission wrestling event as opposed to a shoot fighting event, and even then, there was some question as to whether the commission would allow it to take place, which would have been difficult to stop at this point since it couldn't ban judo matches, a sport with a legendary history at San Jose State University including about 24 national collegiate championships, the site of the event, which also allowed similar techniques that were taking place on the same show. The irony is this event had its rules changed and was nearly stopped on a show with some of the most brutal Muay Thai matches you'd ever want to see, all sanctioned and unencumbered by the State Athletic Commission. Then 1 month ago, at a Draka, Russian form of kickboxing that also allows takedowns, show at the Los Angeles Forum, one of the competitors on that show actually died from a series of head blows. There was no movement whatsoever to ban Draka by the commission or any politicos. In fact, there is no movement at all regarding cancellation of the next show in which Maurice Smith will be a participant. And this was a sport without the established tradition of boxing or auto racing or football in the US where they can easily survive the negative reaction from a death to a participant. Back in 1995, when UFC negative publicity over its brutality was hitting its zenith before that year's Ultimate event in Denver, where the event became a major national news story for nearly 2 weeks, just a few weeks before the event, there was a death to a participant in a far more dangerous tough man contest. That death received no national publicity, at a time when media around the country were referring to the horrors of a potential of a death if the Ultimate event wasn't cancelled, nor did it result in any legislation or political or media posturing over tough man contests, which are generally consisting of untrained non-athletes with no defensive skills pounding on each other with oversized boxing gloves, in which an ignorant media, even at the level of Sports Illustrated, thought were one and the same as NHB. Again, if economic forces dictated the lack of survival of a company, which was the case with some UFC knockoffs such as WCC, WIF and Mars, all of which were done after one show due to a lack of buys, that is no different from the numerous pro wrestling companies that folded during the 80s due to their inability to compete. EFC's death was from a combination of lack of buys, as the shows were losing money, and the realization that under the current environment with more and more cable systems pulling the plug, that they wouldn't be able to turn it around. UFC, on the other hand, was a consistent moneymaker, and though 1996 competed on the same level as WWF and WCW in pay-per-view, until the snowball started rolling downhill against them, to the point where there is almost constant speculation within the industry as to their long-term viability and survival. The opponents of this genre, ignoring the available statistics as it involves a true injury and danger rate of the sport as opposed to other sports where the danger rate is considered socially acceptable, have managed to use a combination of emotional arguments to decision makers who grew up with Western boxing as the only civilized form of pugilism, stating that tactics illegal within boxing were therefore unsportsmanlike, uncivilized and brutal when it came to fighting. Somehow in the 80s, after fighting a somewhat similar fight, the sport of kickboxing managed to survive the arguments, although economically never thrived or really caught on the way UFC did during its first few years, within the United States. It is a battle that as time has gone on, The decision-making processes have relied less and less on logic, and they were never based on logic to begin with. There is no question that to a point, both UFC and EFC are somewhat to blame for this. The EFC show on the Indian reservation in Canada, strongly against the wishes of the Canadian government, gave the entire genre an unsavory outlaw reputation in that entire country, and UFC shows were doing a phenomenal 1.5% buy rate in Canada at the time. After UFC got a law passed in New York State to specifically legalize the events under the auspices of the State Athletic Commission, EFC scheduled a show in New York City, raising the ire of the influential New York Times, which largely shamed the state legislature into reversing its law on the subject in a typical series of stories largely focusing on an apparently sneaky nature in which the law was passed in the first place. During the period after the original law was passed, and before the new law banning the event could be put into effect, UFC had a show scheduled in Niagara Falls, New York that apparently they legally couldn't be stopped from putting on. This is where the State Athletic Commission played its card, imposing the 100-plus page rule book governing the event, which basically changed the event from being a UFC event to an amateur boxing event with headgear, and also, to make sure the event wouldn't take place, just 1 week beforehand mandated that the octagon be no less than 40 feet in diameter. The UFC octagon was 32 feet and the rule was thrown out so late it would have been difficult if not impossible to construct a new one in time, which was the commission's key in getting the event stopped without actually having the actual legal right to ban it. UFC marketed tapes of its early shows with wording calling it the bloodiest, most brutal spectacle of all time and bragging about the event being banned in 49 states, during a time when it actually wasn't banned anywhere. A huge tactical error took place in Detroit, when Semaphore Entertainment Group CEO Bob Marowitz agreed under oath in court after city and state officials managed to pull out an archaic 1800s law clearly aimed at the time of banning the sport of boxing, upon threats of a court-imposed last-minute cancellation of a pay-per-view event that included a sellout at Cobo Arena, to let the show take place with punching and head-butting banned. When the show itself took place, there was no announcement made to the live crowd nor on the pay-per-view of this agreement and the supposed new rules, and it was made clear to the fighters that while there would be warnings for such tactics in the course of a fight, those tactics were not truly being frowned upon and were used regularly throughout the show. By doing the show after making that agreement, and agreeing to never promote a show in Michigan again, UFC became categorized as this company that runs in and out of town with the law and the government one step behind. From that point on, Semaphore Entertainment Group had problems holding events anywhere outside of a few southern states, two of which, Mississippi and Louisiana, have boxing commissions that ironically are going against the grain and embracing NHB events. Louisiana, the host site for UFC's March 13th pay-per-view show, is doing so despite a fiasco in the very first commission-approved event promoted by Buddy Albien in which he drew a phenomenal $180,000 house, but put two Texas pro wrestlers, Rod Price and Perry Action Jackson, in the main event, billing Jackson as an NHB champion from Africa, and they did an obviously worked match causing a riot from spectators and causing the commission to hold up the entire gate. If UFC goes down for the count, what is the long-term prognosis for NHB or whatever the proponents of this genre want to label it as? Probably similar to kickboxing in the US. Events will pop up every now and then, usually in smaller cities, probably with small purses. The few top fighters will either have to rely on Japan and/or teaching, or making the transition into pro wrestling, as three of UFC's top stars, Dan Severn, Ken Shamrock and Don Fry already have, and many others from Brian Johnston to Brad Kohler have indicated interest in following in their footsteps, to make a living because the small purses in the US wouldn't justify their participation. Most of the top stars will avoid facing each other to protect their reputation, following the lead of Hoist Gracie. The other catch-22 of this subject is a bit trickier. People all the time, including some highly ranked pro wrestling officials, have discussed the idea of waiting a few years when the furor dies down and with standards being stretched daily, when it wouldn't seem so upsetting to the media. The idea would be then to start up a UFC-type sport provided UFC doesn't last, changing the name obviously since the name is a neon sign for headline-grabbing politicians, modifying a few rules, and trying to make it a viable pay-per-view entity using pro wrestling marketing tactics but having the matches be real. Before the political problems, UFC proved to be a lucrative and long-term viable pay-per-view entity that could do buy rates on the same level as WWF and WCW. But that will create more problems, because if pro wrestling people are involved, manipulating outcomes to protect marquee players will surely follow, as may have been attempted to some degree already in Japan. And unfortunately for the hardcore followers of the sport and the practitioners of the sport, it appears one of the biggest selling aspects of the event on pay-per-view is the name Ultimate Fighting Championships. Even when UFC was drawing big on pay-per-view, its competitors couldn't really make a dent. None of the other companies, even if they booked a higher quality level of fighters on their shows or advertised like crazy, were able to draw profitable numbers on pay-per-view, and most lost huge amounts of money trying. The unfortunate reality is that UFC's initial success was for people to see the lure of a legalized street fight and the curiosity over if you put all these exotic martial arts against each other in a real fight, who actually would win, or at least what they imagined a legalized street fight would be, and not top-caliber athletes competing in a more civilized-sounding mixed martial arts sport. The early UFCs answered that question. Pure standing skills with no ground experience didn't hold up to the test of reality. It changed the business of martial arts as we know it, which is UFC's most positive contribution to society at large, was exposing the fake aspects of the world of martial arts to a gullible public, forking over millions of dollars every year for self-defense lessons that actually didn't work in situations they were fearing. That question was answered. As fighters actually learned what the sport of fighting entails, such as effective strategies, positioning, and defensive skills, the fights themselves looked nothing like people's imaginations of what a street fight looks like. So at that point, the key marketing aspect had to be making the fighters into superstars, and the curiosity over hyping star versus star B and who would win, the same as boxing, where the imagination of the brutality of the matches usually can't be matched by the action in the match itself. Where UFC failed and where K1 in Japan succeeded, both having started at the same time with the same cult-level original support, is not only an ability to create stars that would go mainstream, but also in keeping those stars. For a student of pro wrestling as a business, and more so the selling of combat sports as a business, there is no more incredible role model than the K1 promotion in Japan. K1 is closer to a pro wrestling circuit than to the sport of boxing. It has a half dozen or so superstars, with names that are now bigger in their culture than the biggest name pro wrestlers are in American culture, who are constantly matched against one another. They are regularly seen in television commercials, and their faces are immediately recognizable in Japan. Their shows draw huge ratings on prime-time network television and draw major celebrities to the live shows that are all instant sellouts. And when Superstar versus Superstar B fight, it's hyped for weeks, and by the time the match takes place, it's a must-see affair. Due to the matchmaking and politics involved, the loser usually is protected or rehabilitated in a way to where their status is maintained. All the top K1 fighters have suffered devastating losses, but as time has gone on, their mainstream names and individual drawing power has only gotten greater. The most recent K1 Grand Prix final sold out the Tokyo Dome in just 1 hour and was on network primetime and did a 20.7 television rating, levels of success that even American or Japanese pro wrestling at their peak couldn't achieve. Where has K1 succeeded where NHB in the US hasn't? The obvious points, besides not running having a war hero in the Senate with ties to existing boxing to deal with, and running afoul of the media looking for a sensationalized, inaccurate story, is not only the ability to create stars, but to keep them in the organization, and to present them in a manner where they look like larger-than-life superstars. Virtually every star K1 has created in Japan still regularly appears on its shows, and virtually every one of them was on the recent Tokyo Dome show. They introduce maybe 1 or 2 new stars every year to add to the mix on top, while continually pushing the old stars. Yes, they are able to succeed at least in some part by occasionally manipulating outcomes to keep superstars looking strong and to have such a high percentage of devastating knockouts which the public pays to see, which are replayed to death forever. Indeed, not only for just atmosphere, but also for action. If there was one single event in the pro wrestling or fighting world that comes across as an event that can't be missed, with the exception of Tyson Holyfield because of the worldwide hype, it was the K1 Grand Prix show. Were they really the best fighters in the world involved? Who knows? Were the matches all completely real? Probably not. But the atmosphere surrounding them was the best in the world and is undeniably real. UFC did create a few early superstars, most notable being Royce Gracie. But Gracie bowed out early and never really lost before leaving, so nobody was really able to fill his shoes, even though most fighters around believe many if not most of the top stars of today would beat Gracie. Then Ken Shamrock, but UFC didn't renew his contract and he turned to pro wrestling. Don Frye did the same. Marco Ruiz never came back. Mark Kerr will probably never come back. It's doubtful Dan Severn will ever be invited back. Oleg Toktarov was last seen going to the finals of the Ultimate, and while injuries may have finished him as a top-level fighter, the UFC audience only knows him as a gutsy Russian that never quit and going about 50 minutes against 3 men in the first Ultimate, including making Ruiz want nothing to do with him. It also never was seen or talked about again. And now the future of Maurice Smith is in doubt. This is to some degree budgetary problems, as if UFC overspent on talent with the limited revenue they bring in with the pay-per-view problems. They won't last. Yet in the current environment with constantly losing talent, They are also losing audience base and whatever aura the organization had of providing fans with the toughest men in the world. Unlike K1, which can sell its tournaments to the public as being the best of the best and the winner could truly claim to be the best stand-up fighter in the world, UFC creates stars, most of whom leave for other organizations and are replaced by some good, a few great and some also-ran fighters. But except for the hardcores, they are simply seen as replacements for the real stars that have disappeared. Whether this is true or not is immaterial, but when Gracie, Severn and Shamrock ruled UFC, the buying public believed they were the best fighters in the world. Whether some of the guys on top today could beat them or not, the fact is, when UFC has a tournament now or a championship match now, nobody believes the person who won is the best fighter in the world, even if they truly may be just that. So title matches mean as much on pay-per-view as the zillion boxing titles that are on the line every week mean. And UFC, due to its stars leaving and the fact the mainstream media shuns any positive mention of it, can't produce its version of the dream match to spike a buy rate, or even match mainstream superstar versus superstar B to where the name value of the superstar will attract the general public to the show. Tank Abbott got over just as UFC began having problems, and while he was the subject of a lot of talk, he was both the best and the worst thing to happen to UFC. The best, in that he was what a large segment of the non-hardcore audience in their imagination liked to believe a street fighter, with his much publicized criminal record and antisocial behavior, was all about. But there is imagination and there is reality. Just as the prison basketball whiz would get exposed going one-on-one with a top NBA player, and biggest, baddest, meanest man in prison would be out of his league against a skilled top-level professional fighter. But the public's imagination says something different. The worst, and that he was an embarrassment at a time because he turned into the focal point of much of the media in UFC's protestations that it was sport and emphasizing his style as barroom brawling. He actually did have some amateur wrestling credentials that were never publicized so as not to tamper with his image. Not just a bunch of beer-bellied brawlers taken out of a local tavern. And even worse, he was given the chance time after time to beat the top fighters, and always found a way to lose. Then, to the point of being pathetic, UFC continually tried to find excuses to legitimize bringing him back and creating scenarios with weak opponents to where he'd eventually finish a show on a winning note. Even with UFC's best efforts, Abbott, through bad luck or lack of conditioning, never came through. As has been mentioned before, 1998 will be a pivotal year for this sport in the United States. Crippled by politicians. Crippled by trying to decide to present the most skilled fighters or go back to what worked in its infancy. Answering the question of putting all these martial arts in a fight and who wins, even though the question has already been answered. Crippled by its hardcores wanting it to be pure sport, including having smaller guys display their skill. And the reality that, like every sport, it can only survive as general public entertainment from a public who sees great fighters as the biggest guy with the hardest punch and hate when the reality of that not being the case is shoved in their face. Crippled by the fact that what makes general public entertainment, the media, will shun it. Crippled by cable companies offering it up as a sacrificial lamb. Crippled by its inability to create superstars, and its inability to keep stars. All of these factors leading to a lessening of interest at the same time the level of the top fighters has probably never been better. Japanese television rundown. December 20th Pancrase. This was the annual major show the group puts on to end the year, this time coming from Yokohama Bunka Gym. There were a lot of interesting aspects to the show, which came one day before the UFC, and thus a lot of very serious martial artists from around the world were at the show. The opener saw Takafumi Ito beat Kusei Kubota in 7:03 with an ankle lock. This was basically two fighters working on the mat looking for a submission. The second match was probably the biggest upset of the year in Pancrase, with Kim Jong-wan beating highly ranked Kunyoku Kyuma in 21 seconds with a scary front choke. Kyuma shot in and got caught with a sick choke cranking so hard the ref screamed in a panic to stop the match and Kyuma was out from it within seconds. Asami Shibuya went to a 13-minute draw with Igor Zinoviev, a NHB champion originally from Russia. The match consisted largely of either one or the other holding their foe in a tight guard. Shibuya came closest with the submissions, but nobody dominated this evenly fought match that wasn't all that exciting. Guy Mesger beat Satoshi Hasegawa in 2:52 with an arm lock. This was interesting because when Mesger got the hold on him, he said to him audibly, "Come on, I don't want to break your arm, please." Hasegawa wouldn't tap and his arm was in a bad position and the ref stopped the match. Mesger explained the situation in a post-match interview, saying the arm was about to break and if the ref hadn't stopped the match, he was going to release the hold because he didn't want to break Hasegawa's arm. Jason DeLucia beat Ikuiza Minowa in 3:47 with a choke from the bottom. This was interesting because DeLucia did a lot of striking from the top while on the ground, which is legal under Pancrase rules but rarely done. DeLucia also got a yellow card at one point for delivering a headbutt to the body, which DeLucia argued, feeling that the headbutt to the body should be legal, but the ref had a different interpretation. After the match, DeLucia talked about striking on the ground, saying that it is legal under Pancrase rules but that they are under a gentleman's agreement not to use that tactic. He said that since Minowa did it first, that the agreement then went out the window. Next, Ryushi Yanagisawa beat John LeBay in 55 with an ankle lock. Both guys were aggressively going for ankle and foot locks at the same time. Yanagisawa told the ref that LeBay's leg had broken. LeBay was so intense he seemingly didn't feel the pain and had no idea. The ref checked LeBay's tibia and saw it was broken and stopped the fight. Yanagisawa was a lot more upset by this than LeBay, as LeBay really showed no expression and acted as if he didn't even notice the pain, while Yanagisawa was visibly crying over doing that to an opponent. Boss Rutan beat Keiichiro Yamamiya in 4:58 with a choke. Rutan got the choke, but Yamamiya got to the ropes. Rutan sunk the hold in so well that Yamamiya was almost out and needed time to recover and continue. As soon as he was able to continue, Rutan caught him with a kick to the chest and got the choke back on for the tap out. Finally, Masakatsu Funaki won the COP title from Yuki Kondo in 2:20 with an entangled armlock off a triangle. For such an important match, since the two had each beaten the other once previously in a title change, there really wasn't much to it other than Funaki simply getting the first submission in the middle. January 21st rings. 1. Wataru Sakata beat Herman Renting in 3:24 with a front necklock submission. Renting is a rings veteran from Holland who hasn't been around much the past few years after being something of a named foreigner in this promotion during its infancy. This match was obviously a shoot because you can't fake that intensity with Sakata dominating the match and looking good, with quick, solid mat work, in doing so. 2. Masayuki Naruse beat Dominique Deligny, a kickboxer from Australia in 1924. Deligny weighed 200 pounds with a good physique, but didn't look roided. This also looked pretty realistic, a shoot at least at some level, or perhaps Naruse carrying Deligny, who was shooting, before putting him away. Even though Naruse had the decided advantage, Deligny got a few reversals and it was competitive, with Deligny actually coming close to getting a shoulder lock and staying near the ropes so he was able to escape whenever he was in trouble. Deligny wanted the match on his feet, of course, but Naruse kept taking him down. Naruse had a 7-0 lead in points before getting the submission with a heel hook in a good match. 3. Tsuyoshi Kosaka beat Sion Latu in 1:58. This also looked like a shoot. Latu, who weighed 201, is an American bodybuilder said to have boxing and judo experience. The crowd got into his look, with shaved bald head and great muscle structure, and he had a lot of natural charisma. Kosaka took him right down, but Latu got over, escaping a few submissions. Kosaka intensely started working for an armbar, but Latu got away, but then Kosaka got the ankle lock for the submission. Really exciting. Even though it was evident from the start that Latu was totally outclassed, he made an impression. 4. Bitsade Terriel beat Hansa Nyman in 6:35. This was a worked match and was the worst match on the card. At one point Nyman even had Terriel's back and just let him up. Really neither wanted to go to the ground, and when they got down there, Nyman would get the positioning edge and then just let him get up. Finish saw Nyman go for a spinning back kick, but his left knee went out and he laid on the mat in pain and the match was stopped. Nyman was walking around fine backstage after the match. 5. Akira Maeda beat Folk Han in the third-place match in the Battle Dimension tournament in just 4:29. Obviously this match was worked, but unlike the previous match, it was good ring style. Everyone seemed to know the story of Han going in with the bad knee. Since this match was exchanging submissions, where Han is the master, as opposed to stand-up, where Maeda gets tired and looks bad, they played to their strengths. Maeda kept going for the knee, and then finally got it, and Han did a tremendous sell job before making the ropes. When he got the knee a second time, Han immediately tapped. 6. Kiyoshi Tamura beat Ilyakine Mikhail in 18:12 to win the Battle Dimension Tournament 97, and also become the first Rings World Heavyweight Champion. When it comes to the ability to make a work match not only look like a shoot, but also within that context deliver more often than not the excitement level of a classic story pro wrestling match, Tamura may be the best worker I've ever seen, and he is definitely the best around right now. Everyone knows and respects his ability within Japanese wrestling and even within the martial arts world, which usually puts down people of this type because they made their reputation in worked matches, and he's even respected by the types that put down Pancrase because of the occasional work. He's going to need all the help he can get, being 194 pounds and being world heavyweight champion and being groomed to be the top star of a pro wrestling company, Akira Maeda is still the top draw, but he'll be retiring this year. His career and this promotion over the next year are going to be very interesting to follow because of such a small man being put in this position in a promotion that purports to be a shoot. His role is also interesting because he was a great underdog because of his size and because his top matches were against people that because of rep he was expected to lose to. He's had some great matches against much bigger men, and as champion, he's now beaten everyone of any substance in the company already. Tamura definitely lived up to his rep here as this match was a total work, yet looked more like a shoot than most shoots do. Mikhail is a colorless performer, but he was good enough in taking, reacting and executing that it was the best rings match in months and very close to the level of the Tamura Han Classics. Before the match started, Bobby Heenan said how neither of these guys would ever give up, thus making sure everyone knew all the submissions were just wrist holds. At one point Mikhail was even working to get a figure 4 leg lock and in the context looked so believable that nobody laughed. Of course at that point Heenan piped in with that Mikhail wasn't using the hold trying to win the match, just showing that he could do that. Mikhail got several near submissions and Tamura's selling was world-class before dramatically getting to the ropes for a break. Of course at that point Tony Schiavone said that neither one really wanted to win at this point in the match to make sure nobody took those spots too seriously. Built great to the finish as Tamura started dominating throws, lots of knees to the chain, and getting 2 knockdowns with them before catching Mikhail in the armbar for the submission. At that point Lee Marshall piped in with how the finishing sequence was reminiscent of the lucha libre style of wrestling. I thought this was a better pro wrestling match than Flair Hart. That says something because of the limitations of doing a totally realistic as compared with serious American style and because not only was it better pro wrestling, but it looked like a shoot. And when was the last truly great pro wrestling match that would fit into the latter category? Mexico. Jose Pianono, the booker for EMLL, has left for Japan and the United States to try and work out deals to broker EMLL talent internationally. EMLL has lost a lot of its top talent and is in danger of losing more due to Promo Azteca's connections with getting wrestlers bookings in Japan, Puerto Rico and the United States and the fact Mexican wrestlers can earn far more abroad. Negotiations with EMLL and Promo Azteca to work together are already falling apart and there is actually the beginnings of talks with Azteca to work with AAA doing an interpromotional angle which would really be ironic with all the lawsuits back and forth. Pepe Aguayo is once again close to jumping to Azteca. EMLL is working hard to keep Lismark, because with his name identity, losing him would really hurt the stability of the office with the wrestlers. Ultimo Dragon has also talked of leaving EMLL for Azteca, but has said that he only wants to work television tapings for Azteca, and the holdup right now is whether Azteca wants to put Dragon over on television every week but be unable to book him around the country from that exposure. EMLL business is said to be really bad, while AAA still draws well at television tapings with Pero Aguayo, but the regular house show business is weak. January 30th in Tijuana drew 3,300 with Cien Carson Psicosis and Villano 5 beating La Parca and Piloto Suicida. Subbing for No Show Rayo del Jalisco Jr. and El Io del Santo on top. Another show on February 1st in the same building headlined by Mil Mascaras and Connect vs Cibernetico and Sangre Chicana drew 300. In the poster, it billed Connect as having beaten Hulk Hogan. Actually there was a famous UA vs WWF title match in 1984 at El Toreo in Naucalpan where Hogan and Connect went to a double count out, but I don't ever recall Hogan putting Connect over, although Andre did a famous clean pinfall job to Connect when Connect was the top star in Mexico at a time when Andre wasn't jobbing for anyone. Reports are that Venom Black, Mr. Aguila, Oro Jr., Shiryu, Mosco and Super Crazy are tearing up the undercards in Mexico. On this week's television, which was taped on January 23rd in Cuautitlan in a match with Aguila and Venom Black and Torero versus Mosco and Crazy and Pantera del Ring, Aguila and Venom at one point did simultaneous shooting star presses. Crazy did a space flying tiger drop and what was called a springboard hurricane rana con hilo, doing it with a twist to the floor, and Venom did a corkscrew plancha over the post into the crowd. Main on that show saw Pirata Morgan retain the IWC heavyweight belt beating Vampiro Canadiense. Expect Azteca feuds with Jurassico vs. Oro Jr. and Tarzan Boy vs. Juventud Guerrera, the latter to wind up with a hair vs. mask match in a few months. February 6th in Nezahualcóyotl is headlined by Vampiro and Tarzan by Zorro and T. Nieblas Jr. vs. Black Magic and Silver King and Pierroth Jr. and Jerry Estrada, Pantera and Salsero and Super Astro and Torero vs. Villanos and El Texano, Aguila and Venom Black and Super Calo and Super Parka vs. Super Crazy and Mosco and Pantera del Ring and Colt and Super Muñeco and Oro and Shiryu vs. Halloween and Damien and Jurassico. The January 30th EMLL show at Arena Coliseo was headlined by La Fiera and Atlantis and Felino vs. Dr. Wagner Jr. and Emilio Charles Jr. and Apollo Dantes and Mascara Magica and Phantasma and Angel Azteca vs. Blue Panther and Violencia and Karloff Lagarde Jr. All Japan. The only thing announced is the main event for the February 28th Budokan Hall show will be Mitsuharu Misawa defending the Triple Crown against Johnny Ace, which will be Ace's first shot in his career at the title and first singles main event at Budokan. Really nothing much else, as Ace was going to the WWF TV tapings to continue negotiations about the Tokyo Dome. WWF came to Japan with a $1 million price tag as a package deal for much of the top talent. Intermediaries for Baba were apparently going to WWF trying to get individual headline wrestlers, as in 2 or 3 guys, Undertaker, Shamrock, and or Vader, at a price of $50,000 apiece. There have also been hints thrown out of Koji Kiao appearing on the Dome show. Kenta Kobashi, who Bruce Pritchard was really high on, said this week that he'd like to go to WWF over the summer and do a program with Vader, who he met when both worked the FMW Kawasaki Stadium show. Apparently Geto and Jado will work the next tour. January 18th TV show did a 3.0 rating. New Japan. Not a lot going on thus far in the current tour. Big Titan is working most of the main events, teaming with various NWO members on the winning side. They did a major upset on January 27th in Fukushima, where a combination of the Freedom Dogs, Michiyoshi Ohara and Tatsutoshi Goto, and Heisei Ishinan, Akira Nagami and Shiro Koshinaka, beat the NWO, Hiroyoshi Tenzan and NWO Sting, who is now undisputedly a tons better worker than the original, and Keiji Muto and Masahiro Chono when Goto pinned Muto after a back suplex. Scott Norton starts on February 4th. Hints are that Naoya Ogawa will be Antonio Inoki's final opponent on April 4th. January 17th TV show, which was the Choshu Farewell show, did a 2.0 rating. The only match on the show was the Choshu vs. 5 Guys, which had already aired 2 weeks earlier. Other Japan notes. Big Japan held a tournament on February 3rd at Korakuen Hall to crown its first junior heavyweight champion. Yoshihiro Tajiri beat Grand Naniwa, Michinoku, Minoru Tanaka, Battle Arts, and Geto Fuyuki Gun to win the tourney. Fuyuki is promoting a show on February 19th at Korakuen Hall with Mr. Ganasuke and Yukihiro Kanemura defending FMW's World Brass Knucks Tag title against Koji Nakagawa and Tetsuhiro Kuroda of Zen, and Fuyuki vs. Hayabusa in a lumberjack match. Fuyuki said that he wanted the wrestlers from the War promotion, which folds at the end of the month, to join his group. They tried to do an angle on February 1st at Korakuen Hall where Manami Toyota and Takako Inoue worked against 2 masked women doing nothing but a brawling match. The fans hated seeing Toyota do that style, to the point that at the end of the show the company apologized to the fans and said on the next show they would be back to doing their regular style. Mayumi Ozaki broke her nose on January 31st in Hakata Star Lanes in a street fight match, losing to Dynamite Kansai, and will be out of action 3 weeks. On February 2nd at Korakuen Hall for the JD office, Jaguar Yokota and Yuko Kosugi in the main event retained their TWF tag titles, beating Bloody and Lioness Asuka. The feeling is JD is also on the ropes as a promotion, and Yokota posing for nude photos is a sign of desperation for attention. Michinoku Pro is supposed to start back up with a tour from March 14th to March 29th. Not only did the Tyson Austin angle get tons of newspaper press, but it was the cover story in this past week's Japanese wrestling magazines, which may be the first time something from the US has made a Japan cover since the Ken Shamrock vs. Hoist Gracie 36 minutes match. The February 12th Weekly Gong had a 2-page rundown on the Observer Awards with photos of Misawa, NWO, Dean Malenko, Bret Hart vs. Steve Austin from MSG, Diamond Dallas Page's Diamond Cutter, Riki Choshu, Maurice Smith, Hickson Gracie vs. Nobuigo Takada and Steve Austin. Here and there. The Cauliflower Alley Club will be holding a roast of Lou Thez as the highlight of its 1998 banquet at the Sportsman's Lodge in Studio City on March 14th. Tiger Jeet Singh's third son, Rob Hans, is now training in Toronto under Ron Hutchison to become a pro wrestler. His oldest son is Tiger Ali Singh in the WWF, who is about to get a major push, and his second son is a police officer. Rey Mysterio Miguel Lopez, the uncle of the WCW wrestler, is featured in a National Miller Lite commercial with a pro wrestling theme. The commercial is getting wide play, including appearing on January 29th during Friends. Music City Wrestling's Fabulous February reunion on February 7th in Nashville has Colorado Kid and Headbangers vs. Terry Golden and Flash Flanagan and Brickhouse Brown, Rock and Roll Express vs. Tennessee Volunteers, Reno Riggins and Stephen Dunn, Wolfie D defends the North American belt against Buddy Landell, Shane Eden vs. Billy Travis and Nick Dinsmore vs. Dutch Mantle. Sabu, Rob Van Dam, Too Cold Scorpio and Tommy Dreamer have been appearing the past 2 weeks for Mike Sample's Tuesday night shows at the Louisville Gardens. Jerry Lawler has been having conversations about getting a promotion started based in Memphis and trying to get back on WMC TV as the flagship station. Pro Wrestling America is running shows on February 6th at Crystal Community Center in Minneapolis, February 7th afternoon show at Indian Center in Minneapolis, and February 8th afternoon at La Courte Oriel's Tribal Casino in Hayward, Wisconsin with Charlie Norris on top. Bob Barnett has videotapes available in both NTSC and PAL format from around the world at japbob@beachnet.com. Blast from the past watch, among the names wrestling at an indie over the weekend was Sheikh Adnan El-Kassi, the former AWA manager. How old? Well, how about this? Kassi wrestled in the 1952 Olympics. Independent Wrestling Federation out of Nutley, New Jersey debuts on March 14th at the Parks and Rec Building. NHB. The latest working ideas for the March 13th pay-per-view is to do a lightweight tournament, with either a 170 or 165-pound limit probably involving the likes of Eugenio Tato, a Brazilian luta livre fighter who fought a legendary draw with Royler Gracie many years ago and recently had a match with Renzo Gracie in Rio de Janeiro which resulted in a riot that banned the sport from that city. Mikey Burnett, a Lion's Den fighter with a strong boxing and wrestling background. Pat Militic, who has a 17-1 record with his only loss coming when the doctor stopped his match with Matt Hume due to a broken nose. And the slot remaining they are hopeful of getting 1996 Olympic silver medalist wrestler Townsend Saunders, so it looks to be a very high-quality lineup. They are hopeful of debuting Hugo Duarte from Brazil in the heavyweight fight with several names mentioned as possible foes. Maurice Smith's name appears to be out the window as due to budgetary problems. His pay was cut back significantly for the potential fight and he's turned it down. The name Tsuyoshi Kosaka has been mentioned as a potential opponent. It also appears that Kevin Jackson will face Fabio Gurgel of Brazil in a singles match with the winner in line for a shot at the Frank Shamrock Igor Zinoviev winner in May. Becky Levi, who has done NHB fighting and has helped train both Dan Severn and Don Fry, will be competing in the Women's Tough Woman pay-per-view on February 6th in Saginaw, Michigan. As best we can tell, the Severn vs. Kevin Rosier match for February 27th in Muncie, Indiana is a go. Kevin Jackson and Melvin Douglas, who finished 7th at the last Olympics in freestyle at 220 pounds and debuts in NHB on March 1st in Japan for Shudo against Enson Inoue, head the U.S. team that will be competing in Titi Cup in Tehran, Iran from February 19th to February 21st. FILA, the International Wrestling Federation, came out with its world ratings with Randy Couture listed as number 7 in the world in Greco at 214 and Tom Erickson was listed at number 9 in the world at 286 in freestyle. ECW. The weekend saw 2 more sellouts with about 700 in New Britain, Connecticut on January 30th and 1,600 at the ECW Arena on January 31st for Hostile City Showdown. The New Britain show was highlighted by a 30 minutes time limit tag team title draw with Chris Candido and Lance Storm retaining the titles against Sabu and Rob Van Dam. Told the first 20 minutes were great, but it got sloppy for the last 10 minutes, but it was probably the best B-show match in ECW in a long time. Main event where Sandman and Tommy Dreamer beat Dudley's was said to have been real bad and Sandman is so racked with injuries there isn't much he can do. Michinoku Pro wrestlers Gran Naniwa and Gran Hamada worked the weekend, with Hamada going over Jerry Lynn the first night and Naniwa losing to Just Incredible, who wore a great Sasuke mask. Shane Douglas returned to the ring having a very good title defense beating Chris Chetty in New Britain. At the arena, the show opened with Lynn and Chetty beating Tracy Smothers and Little Guido. After a ref bumped Jeff Jones come out and refused to count when the faces had the match won. It wound up with Tommy Rogers doing a run-in and using his Tomikes on Smothers, Guido and Tommy Rich and that led to the fall. Sabu and Rob Van Dam beat Axel Rotten and Balls Mahoney when they used the total elimination on Mahoney, which brought out John Cronus to go after them. Spike Dudley pinned Gran Naniwa and Just Incredible beat Gran Hamada with a spinning tombstone in matches that didn't get a lot of reaction. Bigelow and Taz then did the angle with Douglas, Storm, and Candido. The plan for now is to keep the tag titles on Candido and Storm, but they will be reluctant partners that don't get along. Al Snow pinned Doug Furnace using a low blow with the head, and after the match he used the snowplow, Northern Lights bomb, on Lance Wright. Furnace apparently was knocked cold during the match legit and pretty much was working on instinct, so the match really wasn't that good. Main was supposed to be Sandman and Dreamer versus Dudleys. At the beginning, they did the credible angle with Dreamer. It wound up with New Jack and Cronus and Sabu and Van Dam all getting involved and it turning into a four-way match. Sabu and Van Dam wound up winning when Dreamer was fighting with Credible after Credible threw Mikey Whipwreck off the stage, leaving Sandman against both, and he wound up getting pinned. Told that the key angles got over, but overall it was a below-par show. On television this past week, Van Dam did a lift of a 165-pound dumbbell from the floor to the chest while holding a split between chairs, which is far more impressive than he made it look. He claimed the lift was a world record in that kind of a weird lift. WCW. Nitro at the Alamodome was another uneventful show until the final angle. It opened with Juventud Guerrera pinning Psicosis in 7:52 with the Firebird Splash. A lot of good moves and really the best match on either show. Chainsaw Charlie vs. Cactus Jack was more entertaining as comedy, but this was a lot better as wrestling. Highlight was Psicosis coming off the top to the floor with a plancha and Guerrera meeting him with a dropkick. Ultimo Dragon beat Billy Kidman in 5:46 with the Dragon Sleeper. Dragon looked fantastic in this match. Kidman looked so-so. After the match, the entire flock jumped Dragon and Kidman used a shooting star press on him. Kidman used a variation of the power bomb during the match. Nash came out and brought up that point. I guess we should digress to the power bomb story. Apparently ever since he came to WCW, Nash has been under the impression that since he really only does a few things, and the power bomb, or the variation of it that he does, is his finisher, that the move should be protected. Nobody else does the move. There are conflicting schools of thought on that policy. One school of thought is you protect the patented move of the star. The other is that as long as the star doesn't prostitute out his move, let too many people kick out of it too often, an undercard guy can use it and the fans see the difference, as in every pitcher throws a fastball, but that doesn't take away from Randy Johnson's fastball when he's on the mound. Anyway, Nash has wanted guys not to do the move, and when the accident with Giant took place, they decided to do the angle coming out of it, with the end result that nobody in the promotion was going to be allowed to do the power bomb. Nash of course would, and the move would be put over bigger than ever, and he'd be the only one allowed to use it. The downside is it comes across like a behind the times promotion banning the pile driver or jumping off the top rope, as the booing fans reacted to J.J. Dillon when he made the announcement. Anyway, all the wrestlers were told no more power bombs, and they had a translator into Spanish telling all the Mexicans that if any of them did a power bomb they'd be fired on the spot. 1 week later on Nitro we see three, Kidman, Konnan and Scott Steiner, guys doing variations while still trying to keep the angle that it's banned, and Nash keeps getting arrested for doing the move. Anyway, hope he doesn't do it in Sacramento, because we've got a 3 strikes law in this state and he isn't ever getting out. The announcers said the fine if Nash does another power bomb would be increased to $150,000, but they forgot to tell Nash and Hogan that angle, since both in their interviews talked about it being $50,000, and by the end of the show the announcers weren't going to contradict anything Hogan said, so they don't have to break out another case of monopoly money. Nash brought up that Kidman just used the move and why wasn't he fined and arrested. He did a total babyface interview, and naturally got a total babyface reaction. Chris Jericho beat Super Calo to keep the Cruiserweight title with the Boston Crab in 5:08. Real disappointing. Booker T pinned Cellulite Steven Regal in 4:23 with a sidekick that missed. It was Regal's first match back since being out with fluid in his lungs. Unfortunately, Regal came back out of shape and the styles didn't mix well at all. A bad match. Konnan pinned Hugh Morris with something approximating a pedigree in 4:09. Even though Konnan was the heel, he was cheered like crazy. Not good, but it was a hell of a lot better than the last time those two wrestled each other. Scott Hall and Dusty Rhodes came out for an interview. Hall did almost the entire interview, leaving Dusty with just one statement. Dusty has been a huge, not just in weight, disappointment on interviews since turning heel. Scott Hall pinned Jim Neidhart in 2:03 with the edge off the ropes, the Die Hard. Huge pop for the finisher. Louis Spicolli came out to distract Neidhart. Hall and Spicolli kept up on him until Bulldog made the save. Gene Okerlund interviewed Lex Luger, who said nothing. Bill Goldberg destroyed Mark Starr in 1:12 with the jackhammer to the same big pop as always. Whenever I see Goldberg, I can only think how lucky we are in this day and age to have supplements like creatine so all the wrestlers don't have to see a guy like Goldberg getting a push based on nothing but a look and start gobbling up the steroids like everyone did 14 years ago when Nikita Koloff came in and got the exact same reaction, looking almost exactly the same and getting the same push. And I just hope we find a Ric Flair today who can take Goldberg and drag a 4-star match out of him for 35 minutes, and when we find the person who does that, they'll be the man. I wonder if when we do that Goldberg will then also find Jesus, lose 50 pounds, grow his hair back, take out a Lloyds of London policy and never be heard from again? Bulldog went to a double countout with Steve McMichael in 103. Before the match, McMichael did a total babyface interview saying he was from Texas and was going to teach the Englishman a lesson. Match was terrible again. I forgot to mention that as part of the terms of Bulldog's release from the WWF, not only did he have to pay the WWF $150,000 to get out of his contract, but he also had to give Vince McMahon the power of full creative control of his television matches in WCW. No, that's not true. It's just the best explanation I can come up with for what they're doing. I'm still trying to figure out why Ric Flair is at all the tapings. They have 3 hours with almost nothing good to fill it with, and why he's never on television after coming off his best match in years and doing the best interviews in the entire business. And they say booking isn't rocket science. It must be, because I sure can't figure any of it out. Hogan and Bischoff did an interview saying they want Nick Patrick to ref the Cow Palace match. By the way, there are only 700 tickets remaining for the Cow Palace and the advance is around $250,000. Scary when Hogan's interview is the best part of the show. Raven pinned Disco Inferno with a DDT in 458. Even scarier are Raven's hints on television about Jake Roberts coming in. Let's see if you can find one promoter of this past decade who isn't sorry that he gave Jake one more chance. Steiners beat Marcus Bagwell and Kevin Nash in 7:29 when Scott pinned Bagwell after a Frankensteiner. Scott started the match, got pounded on most of the way, and refused to tag Rick, and ended up winning anyway. Rick was furious at him after the match. Finally, Sting beat Randy Savage via DQ in 3:55. Sting came down from the ceiling of the Alamodome, which is about 40 stories high. The entrance got a huge pop and the match had great heat even though they really didn't do much. Savage undid the padding on the turnbuckle and moved when Sting was doing a stinger splash, so he crashed into the unprotected metal. Savage dropped the elbow and went for the pin when Hogan pulled Savage off, somehow causing Savage to lose via DQ. Savage was mad at Hogan costing him the win, so they started arguing where Hogan made it clear he wasn't letting anyone beat Sting before he got a chance to. Before they had a chance to go at it, Luger showed up to spoil the fan and attacked Savage. At this point the NWO came out, but Sting ran them all off. Virtually all the Texas shows this week were sellouts in advance. The main events were scheduled as Flair vs. Curt Hennig, with Flair headlining every house show and Hennig not there after his knee was scoped. That makes even more sense for Flair not to have any interview time to build up the new program. The original replacement was to be Bret Hart, but Bischoff overruled that, feeling that Hart should be treated the same as Hogan and he'd never send Hogan to work in Abilene, Midland, so Hart shouldn't either. So the compromise wound up with Flair vs. Bulldog main events. WCW is claiming about a 1.1 buy rate for sold out, while non-company sources have it pegged at 0.95. Either way, it would be the biggest money show in company history that didn't involve Hogan and apparently be about the same or even slightly ahead of Rumble. Rey Mysterio Jr. had reconstructive surgery on his knee on January 28 in Atlanta. The preliminary view of the doctor is he'll be out of action for 5 months. La Parka's actual injury in the dark match on January 26 Nitro was a blown-out knee, not ankle. The trainer recommended he go to the hospital for an MRI, but Parka wouldn't have any of it and was actually back in the ring and looking good 4 days later in Tijuana. Hector Garza will be getting his knee scoped. Advance for the Nitro on March 2nd in Philadelphia has already topped 10,000 tickets and $181,000. Ron Race looks to be added to Raven's Nest, perhaps in the role of an incompetent spokesperson. Race, who is a legit 7'2", about 2 or 3 inches taller than the Giant, had some in the company not want him around because he's so tall they thought having someone taller than Giant would hurt his gimmick. Thunder on January 29th from the Mid-South Coliseum in Memphis drew a sellout 7,064 fans, 6,911 paying $122,385. The show also drew a 4.2 rating and 6.5 share, 4.1 first hour, 4.3 seconds hour, its best mark to date. Replay did a 1.1 rating and 3.5 share. Page kept the U.S. title, pinning Sick Boy in 444 with the Diamond Cutter. Sick Boy looked to have potential. Meng beat Jim Duggan in 4:15 with a Tongan death grip. Duggan has actually gotten noticeably worse. Just horrible. Raven pinned Marty Jannetty in 3:59 with a DDT. The only comment watching this match is just what a great worker Benoit is. Jerry Lee Lewis was in the crowd. Somehow it was fitting seeing him in the second row at a wrestling card, but it should have been a taping with Lawler doing the color. Goldberg destroyed Yuji Nagata with a jackhammer in 1:33. Hall and Rhodes came out. It was Rhodes' first heel interview and boy did he drop the ball, to the point Hall actually had to cut him off because he was going nowhere babbling about the people in the front office who were mad at him 6 years ago when he was booking and ripping on Tony Schiavone. Hall talked about Piper. Barry Bloom was at Nitro on February 2nd as Rhodes' agent to work out whatever price they were going to work out and whatever program Rhodes would do. Hall beat Disco in 2:59. Disco used the stunner on Hall but Rhodes saved Hall. Nick Patrick did a good interview saying he counted fairly in both Hogan-Sting matches. Booker T kept the TV title pinning Perry Saturn in 6:46 when Saturn crashed into Martel at ringside. After the match Saturn shoved T into Martel and T began arguing. Below average. Benoit and Malenko beat Jericho and Eddie Guerrero when Benoit made Jericho submit to the crossface in 6:38. New Japan style match only lasting half as long. Real good. Benoit and Malenko shook hands after. After the match, Page challenged Benoit for a title match. Benoit really said nothing in the interview and Page carried the segment. Steiners beat Nash and Connon via DQ in 4:52 when Nash hit Rick Steiner with one of the belts. After the match Nash used the jackknife on ref Charles Robinson and was arrested once again. Aside from the Benoit tag, it wasn't much of a show. Add Scott Steiner vs. Bagwell to the Cow Palace pay-per-view. A house show on February 27th in Lincoln, Nebraska sold out the first day tickets went on sale, 5,557 paying $121,540. I believe it was the first pro wrestling show in that city in about 6 years. Hennig was at the Memphis and San Antonio tapings. Jose Lothario was at the San Antonio tapings trying to get a job as a member of the Spanish-language broadcasting team. Pete Lothario, his son, got a tryout dark match. Mike Tenay and Scott Hudson debuted as the announcing team on WCW Saturday Night over the weekend. They had their work cut out for them with a Goldberg vs. Meng main event, which, as bad as it sounds, was actually worse as Goldberg blew up having to go 6 minutes and couldn't do his jackhammer right and ended up dropping Meng on his head, which Meng wasn't particularly thrilled with as you could imagine. Some would say that Meng didn't go up well, but that wouldn't explain the follow-up, when Goldberg did his move to Jimmy Hart and also lost control of him and dropped him on his head. Tenay and Hudson had to do a big-time cover-up for that fiasco. There is talk of adding Arn Anderson as a third member of that team, which if Anderson's announcing is 1/10 as good as his interviews, he'd be a natural at. Media Week ran a story on WCW wrestling in the latest issue. It's basically saying that even though WCW programming gets great ratings, they can't sell ads commensurate with their ratings because of the perception among big-money advertisers not to buy wrestling. Bischoff claimed a growing body of research saying pro wrestling's viewers aren't limited to trailer parks and that some have college educations, significant disposable income and consider wrestling entertaining. That may be part of the method behind the madness of showing all those videos of college kids having fun watching Nitro every week. Bischoff admitted that even with the facts, there is a perception and stigma about wrestling which has been hard for the company to overcome. Neil Cameron, the head of Ogilvy and Mather South in Atlanta, the advertising agency WCW hired to try and break the perception, claims all it will take is one major advertiser to sign up a sponsoring package to break the holdouts of the end-user Bushes, the General Motors, Coca-Colas, Nikes, and Microsofts. The feeling is the only way advertisers will buy pro wrestling is if it's presented as goofy entertainment rather than a serious pseudo-sport. Even though the WCW promotion has from its inception been built around pay-per-view and television ad sales as its main source of revenue, with doing arena events a distant third, the arena business has become so successful, it has blown by selling ad time at a revenue source, which actually means house show business is actually more important than television ratings, at least for revenue. WCW has 31 house shows booked for the month of May without one day off. Watch the injury and divorce rates multiply this summer. The May pay-per-view show will be May 17th from Maple Leaf Gardens in Toronto. One would think that would be Hogan vs. Bret Hart, but I'm told that match is likely to be held off until Starrcade as they learned the lesson this year about teasing a match all year before delivering it. WWF, the February 2nd Raw from Indianapolis was built around an angle which started off as an angle of the year, and ended up as a goofy Three Stooges skit. It started with Terry Funk and Cactus Jack doing great interviews building up a singles match between the two. They had a 10 minutes match which was very entertaining although goofy in spots, them handing each other garbage cans to him each other with, before Jack put Funk in a garbage dumpster and came off the Titantron with an elbow into the dumpster. At that point the New Age Outlaws came out and tied the dumpster shut and threw it off the stage through some tables. Although it was a very carefully planned stunt, as the floor area was set up for the landing and the dumpster was noticeably filled with styrofoam and puffy trash bags, Jim Ross and the promotion did an incredible job of selling it as something that wasn't scripted to happen and something very serious. They showed the Outlaws apologizing to a furious Vince McMahon, a show stopped, and portrayed it as a planned angle that backfired with Ross using lots of inside lingo and calling the victims Terry Funk and Mick Foley rather than their ring names. Sonny was shown crying like crazy to the point of being hysterical. They took them out in an ambulance, both stretchered out of the dumpster in neck braces motionless. Ross used inside terminology such as going into business for yourself, a term for a wrestler doing their own angle against boss's wishes, such as when Bret Hart and Ric Flair bladed themselves at the 1992 WrestleMania unbeknownst to McMahon, who actually heavily fined Flair and was really upset at him for doing so, talking about the Outlaws getting a push and using their TV time to get over and constant talking about how far the envelope has been pushed in a desire to get ratings. At one point Flash Funk went to attack the Outlaws, and later a total brawl took place. The Outlaws looked apologetic until Michaels and Helmsley, who did a cute skit to open the show talking about all the flack their antics have gotten on TSN in Canada and Sky Sports in Europe, neither of which air the first 3 minutes of Raw when this segment aired, and spoofing the Clinton scandal, told them they had to forget about it and do whatever it takes to draw the ratings and get themselves over and everyone else be damned. At a point it was good. While the show was compelling, the angle was destroyed over the next hour. Owen Hart beat Billy Gunn via DQ in a European title match in 5:29 when Jam interfered. DX came out and they did a 5-on-1 on Hart and teased throwing him off the stage until the agents made the save. Coming off the previous angle, it just watered down the angle by doing a weaker version of the same thing again. And even though the angles were well done, the new reactions were noticeable about wrestlers being farm animals to do tricks rather than soap opera characters. There was a huge positive pop when the dumpster went off the cliff and tons of booing when the agents stopped DX from throwing Hart overboard. They did a few segments with Michael Cole on location in the hospital to get word on Funk and Jack, but of course he knew nothing. The signal wound up going out just as he was hysterical about cops showing up. Finally, after plugging a Steve Austin match, again, for the entire show, they had only 39 seconds before everyone ran in for the DQ, and then Funk and Jack, teased just minutes earlier as being comatose, did a run-in, with Funk wearing a hospital robe and his grungy underwear noticeable running around with a chainsaw, and Jack doing a run-in hooked up 2 and 4. While creative, to a lesser extent the Hart deal and the final run-in completely took the initial angle away from being an angle gone awry resulting in serious heat, to just an obviously planned stunt man spot in a badly acted made-for-TV play. Did it work? Tune in next week when we find out the Monday night ratings. In other segments on the show, Mark Marrow pinned Mosh after a low blow in 2:26. Goldust came out dressed as Marilyn Manson as Marrow's new tag partner to set up a tag match on the pay-per-view. Chains beat Farouk via countout in 2:30 when Farouk was arguing with Kama outside the ring and lost. Blackjack Bradshaw, whose real name isn't John Hawk or Justin Bradshaw but actually John Hayfield, and Flash Funk beat Barry Windham and Jeff Jarrett. Funk was attacked by the Rock and Roll Express and carried out, leaving Bradshaw, who is getting the mega push right now, trying to create a 90s version of Stan Hansen, and using that name regularly in conjunction with him, by himself. Bradshaw still ended up hitting the lariat on Jarrett for the pin in 7:03 to set up the title match on pay-per-view. The entire NWA destroyed Bradshaw after the match, with Jarrett holding a figure 4 on him while a newly blonde Barry Windham kept jumping on his bad knees that ended his football career. Hard to believe since Windham looks so old and people think of Bradshaw as a rising young star, but actually Windham and Bradshaw are the same age, 37. They also did an angle where Kane was about to destroy promoter Bob Collins, called Wink Collins, who acted as if they had sold the Fleet Center out in 90 seconds rather than the actual deal where most of the building was sold out in mail orders from months back and they only put a few tickets on sale. Anyway, Vader saved Collins and sprayed a fire extinguisher all over Kane and Bearer. The tag team Big Time that got the tryout in California consisted of Hank Hill, a bodybuilder who actually was in his first 2 matches, and Tom Howard, who has wrestled for years under various names, most notably as KGB and AAA. Tiger Ali Singh got a TV video push as a jet-setting famous model/actor role who was putting aside his modeling and acting fame to concentrate first on becoming a pro wrestling superstar. There will be no Slammy Awards this year. Not sure of the reason. The April 27th pay-per-view show was moved from Chicago to Greensboro, with subsequent TV tapings on April 28th in Hampton, Virginia and April 29th in Richmond, Virginia. Sonny did a photo shoot for the cover of Muscle and Fitness magazine. Ahmed Johnson was hospitalized the morning of February 2nd when he collapsed on the airplane in Indianapolis due to dehydration. He did appear in Chain's Corner at the taping but probably will be out of action for a few days. A correction. The Massachusetts Indy where the WWF trainees did their matches actually drew closer to 100 than 300 fans. Glenn Kolka, the CFL football star who isn't allowed across the border yet, blew out his knee on January 28 doing a show in Regina, Saskatchewan. Kolka was in the main event against Jackal in a match billed as a combination IWA. Tony Condello was the promoter, and WWF Canada President Carl DeMarco has a deal with Condello to promote shows in Manitoba and Saskatchewan using some WWF trainees including the two mentioned along with Adam Copeland along with veterans like Kerry Brown, Bad News Allen and Jerry Morrow before 850 fans, most of which were giveaways. Kolka, who signed a 3-year contract with the WWF after retiring from the CFL, before the match actually started jumped off the middle rope and landed poorly and his knee went out, suffering a dislocated kneecap, a broken bone in the lower leg and a torn posterior cruciate ligament. It was pretty obvious to most in attendance, but he tried to work a match anyway although the leg wouldn't support him and Jackal used a weak shot with Kolka's football helmet to send the match home early. Apparently his legal problems were that his dog disappeared, and he found him a few days later being walked by somebody else, and one thing led to another. There was a commotion, Kolka did a number on him and the police came. Kolka's football career apparently ended when he fractured a vertebrae in the 1996 season. Vic Ziegel in the New York Daily News wrote a column on January 28 about Austin due to the Tyson pub. It was generally a sympathetic portrayal of Austin. Only thing at press time we know of regarding the February 3rd tapings in Evansville, Indiana, is the show was built around Austin stealing the WWF title belt from Michaels. The readers' pages. False advertising. How close is WCW coming to some sort of false advertising and or misleading programming when they constantly tease something that never happens? They promised us a Hogan Sting match, even had Michael Buffer ready to go, but never showed us the finish. Tony Schiavone actually had the nerve to tell us the policy of WCW, Nitro and Thunder is to show the main event in its entirety, and the entire push of the first Thunder was to see the Nitro main event finished, that they left early. WCW Saturday Night spent the entire show teasing that they were going to show us footage only to not show it at the end because NWO lawyers filed an injunction. All of this was not only distasteful, totally unnecessary and may have been illegal. The ratings are already good. Why must they try to rip us off constantly? Hopefully somebody at TBS or TNT will realize just how distasteful this really is. Paul Nucci. Manistee, Michigan. Response from Dave Meltzer, because business is good both companies are more cocky about what they'll attempt to get away with. Since both companies virtually on a nightly basis advertise one set of matches at the arena and frequently top stars that are advertised don't appear, more often than not for very good reasons such as late injuries, there are often no announcements posted at the ticket window regarding the lineup changes nor even announcements made at the beginning of the show. There was no crawl on the screen on the Starrcade pregame show about Nash, Raven and Kana not appearing and certainly Nash was in a key match that wasn't replaced on the show and pushed heavily on the pregame show. When it comes to Mondays, WWF has been more far guilty than WCW, not that doing something less makes one any less wrong when doing it, about teasing something throughout until the end of the show and not delivering on it. Right now both companies because business is so good and the product is so hot feel they have the carte blanche to pretty much do anything, and a lot of the stars have gotten the attitude that just making an appearance is enough and actually feel put upon when asked to do a wrestling match. It's going to get worse before it gets better, and it won't get better until the cycle goes back down and the promotions again feel they have to play fair to their more loyal but dwindling customers. Casas. Mexican wrestling has been on a steady decline since 1995 and it may have hit rock bottom with the December 19th show in Tijuana. I've always respected Negro Casas. His classic matches with El Hijo del Santo at the Olympic Auditorium in 1987 were my first true introduction to Lucha Libre and my respect is such that I've always considered him the Ric Flair of Mexico. I've always gone out of my way to pay to watch him perform, but I now detect a pattern. No matter where I've seen him over the past 10 years, his matches have always been disappointing. Not bad, just missing that thing that makes a match special. It's always less than you expect going in. His exhibition in Tijuana may have topped it when it was obvious to everyone that he was wrestling drunk, and in his embarrassment of not getting over, changed the whole storyline of the match. The abomination ended with every wrestler in Tijuana turning on Santo. For no good reason, they all beat on him for 20 minutes, tearing up his mask and dragging him in and out of the ring. The crowd hated it, but didn't react this time. Nobody tired to save Santo, and after the other wrestlers left, he laid unmasked in the ring for 5 minutes before getting attended to. What killed me wasn't the mistreatment of Santo, it was turning every single wrestler from Tijuana into a punk heel. Even Rey Mysterio Jr. looked bad because he didn't make the obvious save. I hated the angle, and so apparently did everyone else, because it got no heat. The crowd stayed dead for the Mask vs. Mask Mysterio Jr. vs. Misterioso match that had been pushed for the last 9 months. The first 2 falls were terrible considering Rey was in the ring. Even when it picked up in the 3rd fall, the crowd reaction was still silence. It wasn't until the pin that the crowd popped. To compare the heat of this match to the Rey-Eddie Guerrero match in Las Vegas is a joke. The business in Tijuana may be unkillable, but a card like this with its total waste of wrestling and booking talent really tests that theory, just to have the Mexicans mimic the American promotion's NWO and DX angles. Steve Yohei. Montebello, California. WWF. What the hell is wrong with the WWF? For years this promotion has relied on 6'4+ wrestlers who can't work at all. I attended the January 20th TV tapings in Davis, California, where a dark match between 2 local wrestlers, Aaron O'Grady and Vic Grimes, was head and shoulders above every other match on the card. The second best match was Brian Christopher vs. Pantera. It's a pathetic sign when the 2 best matches on the card are basically just there to fill time. The WWF needs to emphasize some wrestlers who can wrestle. However, looking at the names and sizes of all the new wrestlers the WWF has signed over the past few months tells me we have a lot of undercard yawners awaiting us. Jason Singh. Vallejo, California. WCW. I just witnessed the January 26th Nitro and the match between Davey Boy Smith and Steve McMichael. Okay, obviously McMichael is horrid. He has no balance, no ring presence, as he's awful on the mic. I mean, Kurgan is all of the above, but at least they don't give him the mic. I've seen Smith use the running power slam on numerous guys. Way bigger than McMichael, yet McMichael still found a way to screw it up. The question is, why is he continually pushed? And when will Larry Zbyszko please shut up about his glorious career and the human game of chess? He should find a new saying. I think he actually believes he is a living legend. Scott Hall hit the nail on the head. He was a world champion because his father-in-law was the owner of the group, and it was a dying company that folded when he was champion. Every time Zbyszko sees something that he doesn't understand, case in point foreign wrestlers, instead of trying to learn it or keep up with the times, he mocks it. Real mature. As for Mike Tyson, I think the smartest thing the WWF could have done would have been for a repeat of the first WrestleMania angle. Have DX attack Austin after the Rumble and have Tyson help out his new friend Cold Stone. Have a tag match with Triple H and Shawn versus Tyson and Austin. You can have Tyson and Austin go to the back, making it a singles match with Michaels versus Austin, and give Michaels a screw job win with help from Chyna, and put Austin versus Michaels at WrestleMania with Tyson as the enforcer. Triple H tries to interfere and Tyson KOs him. Chyna comes down to ringside and Tyson won't touch her even though she pushes him and taunts him. The announcers play it up big. Chyna interferes, giving Michaels the advantage, then her interference backfires, allowing Austin to win with the Stone Cold Stunner. The WWF gets the press of Tyson's involvement. Tyson gets a good guy image, particularly with his refusal to hit a woman. Austin gets the title. Michaels doesn't have to do a clean job. The WWF is happy. Tyson is happy. Austin is happy. Shawn is, well, probably never happy, but 3 out of 4 isn't bad. John Segru. San Luis, California. ECW. I usually find that Joey Styles and the ECW television show are terribly overrated, but I gained a lot of respect for Styles and ECW based on their FMW Japan Tour episode. The segment that Tommy Dreamer narrated concerning his relationship with Terry Funk was excellent. The various highlights on Gladiator, Masato Tanaka, Yukihiro Kanemura and Atsushi Onita were also excellent. This is based on how Styles introduced the different characters and their significance to the promotion. It's amazing that Styles came off so credible during this segment, especially when you compare it to the many times I cringe when he continually tells us how great Justin Competent supposedly is. The video package will hopefully introduce the FMW wrestlers to those who aren't familiar with them. Hopefully this will prevent ignorant racist chants concerning unknown Japanese wrestlers. WWF and WCW could learn something when it came to introducing unknown international wrestling stars. If both groups introduced new wrestlers in this manner, maybe Takamichi Inoku and the Mexican wrestlers in WCW would have meant something. Jim Cornette and Mike Tenay can't be the only prepared announcers in the two major companies. It's time for the other announcers to start doing preparation work for their broadcasts. One must be skeptical of Giant Baba's attempt to run the Tokyo Dome in May. Currently Baba has nothing new or fresh to offer. They've seen almost everything Mitsuharu Misawa, Kenta Kobashi and Toshiaki Kawada are capable of, and that can be accomplished within their style. The only answer is an interpromotional feud or a major retirement match. Obviously an interpromotional feud could be highly successful, but what promotion can they work with besides New Japan that would mean anything? A feud with Kingdom might work if there is any juice left in Nobuhiko Takada's drawing power. And that probably would be difficult to put together. There is no other Japanese wrestlers or promotions that could help them draw a big gate at the Dome other than New Japan. Genichiro Tenryu has nothing left in value for interpromotional matches. He barely means anything in his own company, which gets worse by the year. FMW would be a major style clash. Maybe Atsushi Onita could mean something due to his drawing power and cult following. But it seems like WWF is Baba's only choice since there is no other viable alternative. The inherent problems will become major obstacles. WWF had no drawing power when ran a tour in 1994. Don't forget all the problems that occurred at the 1990 Wrestling Summit show. If Vince McMahon can't even get Shawn Michaels to do a job in his promotion, what makes them think they can get WWF wrestlers to do jobs on their show? Don't forget that most of the WWF wrestlers are not compatible to the All Japan style, and most mean very little in Japan. My prediction for Music City Wrestling isn't a bright future. Burt Prentice has had numerous wrestling companies prior to Music City, all of which went out of business for various reasons. I've seen 2 tapes of Ian Rotten's group. His shows resemble ECW Blood and Guts shows and are enjoyable, but they are clearly a knockoff of ECW. Ian Rotten plays the same role as Tommy Dreamer. It's hard to imagine that the possible savior of wrestling in Kentucky is an American version of Shoji Nakamaki, a terrible worker who will do insane things to his body just to get a pop. As long as he has a blade to mutilate his body with, he'll probably have an audience. Eric Bimbin. Brooklyn, New York. At the January 24th ECW Revere show, my fiancée asked a security guard whom she knew if she could help her get an autograph of Taz for a friend. Jerome Young was by the curtain at the time and told my fiancée that he wanted to meet up with her after the next match. When my fiancée did not return, he sought her out in the crowd and asked her if she wanted to get together after his show at the Squire. I then told Mr. Young that she was my fiancée and to leave. Mr. Young started verbally assaulting me, calling me a bitch and a white boy, and challenged me. I told him that I was right there if he wanted me, all he had to do was jump. That was probably stupid on my part, but I had a little liquid courage in me. Security arrived and told me that I would have to leave. I told them I wasn't going anywhere. When they assessed the situation, they figured out I wasn't the one at fault as Mr. Young came over to us. As he was leaving, he said something along the lines of "you know who she really wants," which incensed my fiancée to the point she had to be restrained. My fiancée is not one of the trash who hangs around after a show trying to hook up with wrestlers. She only knows of New Jack as the guy who brings in the trash cans. When the head of security came and found out what caused the problem, he rolled his eyes and apologized to us. If Paul Heyman wants to allow his performers to interact with fans while the show is going on, that's his business. But he'd better exert a little more control over his wrestlers. If anything had happened to my fiancée or to myself that night, he'd be looking at quite a large lawsuit. Michael Cords. Brockton, Massachusetts. Boob jobs. Far be it for me to be a feminist, but doesn't the fact that every woman in WWF, WCW and ECW have boob jobs bother you? What message does it send to young women who watch pro wrestling? The only way to get a job in the business is to have breast implants? I personally find silicone boobs unattractive for the most part. While I can see why Chyna and Luna got boob jobs, it doesn't make either of them more attractive. Joni Lee is still a musclehead, but now she's a musclehead with fake boobs. And what gives with Sable? She looks like she could co-star with Jenna Jameson in her next porno. Did you see the Raw swimsuit issue? I clipped a couple of the sunny photos for the wall, but Sports Illustrated has nothing to worry about. The one that I didn't understand getting a boob job was Francine. Paul Heyman is nuts to keep Tommy Dreamer out there. He's in worse shape physically than Steve Austin, and he keeps going out there to work long matches. He's either too stupid or too stubborn to get himself out of the ring, so somebody should force him to sit out. How long do Chris Benoit, Chris Jericho and Ultimo Dragon have on their WCW deals? They should count the days and get the hell out. The powers that be in the company should be ashamed of themselves for wasting talent of that caliber. Andy Thurston, Waltham, Massachusetts. Response from Dave Meltzer: the boob job deal is the same thing as the steroids for men from a cosmetic standpoint. I don't know if the health risks are comparable because it's not a subject I've studied, and it appears some of the health risks may be overstated, but then again, they're with steroids as well. I think it sends a terrible message to women, but wrestling sends so many terrible messages to kids in the first place, and the whole attitude toward women of so many in the decision making is sad. But a lot of today's new audience of white trash males gets off on the female degradation, and if you expect any morals when it comes to the wrestling business, you will be constantly disappointed. I believe Benoit and Jericho have 18 months to 2 years left on their WCW deals. Not sure about Dragon. The WCW attitude toward the more talented undercard wrestlers seems to be that since they pay so well, that the guys should be happy even if they aren't given a big push. It works for many because first and foremost this is a business. But logic would tell you that the more talented a performer someone is, the more passion they have for their craft, and the more passion one has for their craft, the less the dollar figure on the check means to their happiness when compared with being held back from reaching one's potential. Still, it is very hard for someone with a family to leave a job that guarantees big money for a job making less money, particularly if it's considerably less. WWF. Add my name to the list of those thrilled with the new direction of the WWF. My first road trip for a pro wrestling match was a decade ago when I went to Atlanta for the first War Games. I thought I'd never be able to relive the amazement of that match as the industry became more and more sugar-coated. Hell in the Cell proved me wrong. After years of seeing 4th generation FMW and Wings tapes, seeing Cactus Jack and Chainsaw Charlie in live crisp color returned me to my level of early 80s Georgia wrestling. Michael Roper. Oakland Park, Florida.